Greetings, scholars. Okay, Washington Part 2. Washington Part 2. We're going to discuss Alexander Hamilton's economic policies in Washington's administration. This causes problems. Alexander Hamilton is not trusted by Thomas Jefferson because Alexander Hamilton keeps interfering in affairs of state rather than sticking to the Treasury. George Washington wanted Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of State, but he turned down the job and requested to become the Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton wanted to hold the money bag. He wanted to hold the money. Some of Hamilton's economic policies is not only going to make him enemies with the Republicans, the anti-federalists, but even within his own party, he's going to cause rifts and division because of his policies. John Adams goes so far as to declare him treasonous. Both of them are Federalist. John Adams declares he's trying to rip off the United States with these policies. He's trying to enrich himself, and then Madison, James Madison, who assisted him in writing the Federalist Papers, James Madison, the author, primary author of the Constitution, is also going to be opposed to much of Alexander Hamilton's economic policies, and it's going to cause Madison to stop being a Federalist, and he's going to become a Republican. Even though he is the author of the Constitution, he was one of the Federalists in the Federalist Papers, but the way he views Alexander Hamilton abusing this system, it causes him to go the other direction. Now, Hamilton's policies, again, are going to be problematic because of his involvement in foreign banks and his attraction to British businesses. As a Federalist, most Federalists are more pro-British than they are pro-French. The primary task that Hamilton sees himself involved in is trying to pay off the public debt. This is the monies we've incurred, the debt we've incurred fighting the war. Okay, so it's an enormous amount of debt. And then we'll talk about the creation of the first bank of the United States, which also Madison and Jefferson had been opposed to, but Hamilton is able to use wording in the Constitution to make it justified, so that even though both in principle disagreed with the central bank, they had to agree that the Constitution's language allowed for it. And then the resulting whiskey rebellion that comes out of it. Now, this public debt, there is $52 million owed in public debt. We've depended upon Americans to give money to help fight this war. And the idea is that now that the war is over, these bonds are due. We have to give these people their money back. We have to pay them for the materials that they use to help fight the war. 11.7 million we owe to foreign creditors, the French and the Spanish, and to lesser degrees other countries that were involved in rendering assistance to the United States as we were fighting our revolution against England. And then 40 million more in bonds that were due. Now, this is how this is part of the place where John Adams is going to call Hamilton a traitor. Every American had an obligation to serve in the military. If you didn't serve in one of your local militias, then you served in the National Army. So each state had its state militia, and there was a Continental Army of full-time soldiers for the country itself. Each person was obligated to serve a year. Now, if you would sign a contract that would say that you will fight until the duration of the war, then you could receive a bond worth $100. Worth $100. And this is 1776 money. That's a lot of money, $100 back then. You could set yourself up with a lot of land and build a house with that kind of money. But you wouldn't get the money until later, okay? So a lot of people signed up for the war, and they signed up till the duration of the war, and so they had these bonds. And now the war's been over for almost 10 years, and the bonds aren't due yet. The bonds aren't ready to be cashed in yet, but people don't have any money. These people are destitute. They don't have jobs. They don't have money. They need capital. Now, some entrepreneurial individuals have been running around the country offering to buy up these bonds. Because these bonds will turn out to be like IOUs. Okay? And so they'll set up in a town, and they'll post posters that say, "Come to the livery stable today, and if you have a bond, we will purchase the bond from you." It's kind of like J.G. Wentworth, right? It's my money, I want it now. So if you've got a lottery winner, or you've got an annuity, or you've got something that's paying you money over time, J.G. Wentworth will swoop in and he will buy you out because he's got the time to wait. Now, you won't get full face value. If somebody owes you, if you're being paid out of $1 million, then J.G. Wentworth will probably only give you $750,000, right? Because he can afford to wait the time that it takes to get the rest of the money. So what happens is when you show up with your $100 bond, you hand it over to the guy, and he hands you a $5 bill. And you say, "Wait a minute, that's a $100 bond." And the guy says, "I'm offering you $5 for it. $5 hard money, $5 cash," right? And so these people are stuck because they're almost to the point of being destitute. Now, you can hold on to that bond, but you have no money, right? Or you can sell this bond for $5, and this guy walks away with a $100 bond on its face value that he purchased for $5. What happens is we find out that the individuals going around the country buying up all these bonds are Alexander Hamilton's friends. They're the ones that he's told about his plan. Because what Hamilton plans to do is he plans to fund all of the debt. That means Hamilton plans to go to other banks and borrow money to pay off the debt. So everybody with a $100 bond will get a full $100 for the bond. The thing that makes Adams so angry is Adams says, "How will we guarantee that the individuals who is owed that money is going to get that money?" And Hamilton's response on the floor of the Senate is, "These are bearer bonds. These people are free to do whatever they want to with the bonds. And if they choose to sell those bonds to someone else, then the person they sold it to is now the bearer of that bond. And so all of the bonds must be paid at full face value." Hamilton's friends went all over the country buying up millions of dollars worth of bonds at 1/20th of their value. This is what made John Adams so angry, and it just caused a complete rift between the two. A lot of people bought up these IOUs, and they're planning on making a lot of money, and they're going to. The states also collectively have an additional $25 million in debt. Hamilton says we're going to absorb all of the state's debt also. So all of this money is going to be pulled together, and we are going to consolidate it, and we're going to go to a different bank, and we're going to borrow money, and we're going to pay off the debt. Then we will be debt-free for the next 5 years. Because in 5 years, the new debt comes due with interest. So what's the plan for the new debt? We're going to borrow money, and we're going to pay off the debt, and then we'll be debt-free, right? For 5 years. People talk about our national debt. This is where it starts. This is where it starts. Alexander Hamilton, his economic plan was opposed by both Jefferson and Hamilton, or both Jefferson and Madison. Both Jefferson and Madison said what we need to do is tighten our belts, put our nose to the grindstone. We need to scrimp and save and live within our means, and all of those kinds of things that you hear when somebody goes through a good budgeting class. Well, Hamilton gets his measure through the Congress, and the Congress is going to absorb all the debt, and all of these individuals that Hamilton knows who purchased these bonds are going to get an enormous windfall. An enormous amount of money is going to come their way. And you'll see why this is important here in a minute. When asked how are we going to pay off this national debt, he proposes a single tax system, a 25% tax on distilled spirits. We're going to drink down the national debt, he says. Now, every person who distills spirits will have to pay a 25 cents on the dollar of the value of these spirits that are made. Now, who distills spirits? Who makes whiskey? Well, if you're a wheat farmer, any surplus you have in your wheat crop, in your rye, in your oats, and your barleys, any surplus you have, this is turned into whiskey. It's turned into whiskey. If you can't sell it, you can't keep it in your barns forever. You know, you can't store wheat for 20, 30 years because it will rot. It will rot. However, if you take that excess wheat and you distill it in whiskey and seal it in barrels, most people who like to drink that kind of thing would appreciate it if you leave it in those barrels for 25 or 30 years so that it ages and all that kind of stuff. So during this time period, the person in the state of Virginia that distills the most whiskey is George Washington. George Washington isn't, he's busy being the president, so all the crops that are being grown at Mount Vernon at his house aren't necessarily being sold to market. Much of what he grows is actually going to the distillery, his own distillery right there on the property in Mount Vernon. So this 25% tax is going to be what's used to pay down the war debt. Now, here's the problem. Let's say you're a farmer, right? Madison is against the plan. Madison rails against the plan. And Jefferson also feared the plan. He believed the plan was going to cause problems long term, especially the idea of going forward with this whole notion of the national debt. And we'll get to those farmers here in a second. The next thing Hamilton does is he comes to the Congress and he requests that the Congress pass legislation for the creation of a central bank. It will be a privately owned bank in Washington that will house the nation's wealth. It will house the nation's wealth. He petitions the Congress. Both Madison and Jefferson are against it. Jefferson articulates these ideas in saying that the wealth of the nation is spread out amongst the states, as it should be, right? Because as the states need the money, but Madison agrees with it. Hamilton makes the argument that as the Secretary of the Treasury, he needs to pay the bills of the country, he needs to pay the soldiers, he needs to negotiate agreements and things like that. He needs access to the nation's wealth. And so the Congress, again, based on a clause that when Jefferson brings up the fact that there is no national bank mentioned in the Constitution, excuse me, when he says there is no national bank mentioned in the Constitution, Hamilton points out the fact that the Congress shall make any law that is necessary and proper to the successful completion of the mission of the executive branch. Hamilton makes the argument that the central bank is necessary and proper for the successful completion of his duties in the executive branch. But it's a private bank. It's a private bank. It's just a bank that will be used to house the nation's wealth. Now, the Congress, once they agreed to establishment of this national bank, they asked Hamilton how he plans to capitalize such a bank. Well, Hamilton says, I happen to know of a group of individuals who've just recently come into a large sum of money, who would be willing to create a bank and capitalize it so that the business of the nation can be done through that bank. Do we have any idea who those individuals who just came into enormous amounts of wealth? Those individuals who bought up those war bonds, making John Adams even more adamant that Alexander Hamilton was trying to basically economically take over the country. John Adams would not be one of the individuals who would have loved to go see the Hamilton play, because as far as he would have been concerned, it makes Hamilton appear to be too much of a good guy. And it's why I like to refer to him as Dr. Evil. He just looks, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Now, the tax. The tax. In 1791, when this news comes out, the farmers are angry. The farmers are angry. The idea that they are going to be the ones responsible to pay for the entire war. To pay for this entire war. In 1792, the Congress tried to amend the whiskey tax, but it doesn't give any help, because the whiskey tax is designed to only tax people who distill spirits. There are extremely wealthy individuals in New York and in Massachusetts who live along the coast, who don't own land, who don't farm, who don't produce spirits, and they are getting away without having to pay for the war at all. And these farmers are winding up footing the bill, and they don't like it. They don't like it. So how have we always dealt with taxes in the past? Well, we evade the tax, and we tar and feather the tax collectors. And if we have to, we start shooting at people. Right? That's how we've always done it. That's how we did it in Shays' Rebellion, back under the Articles of Confederation. In 1794, John Neville is going to charge 75 people with tax evasion in Massachusetts. He's going to charge these people, Pennsylvania. Immediately, once the shooting starts, these people who live in western Pennsylvania are being forced to pay this tax, and they refuse. Once the shooting starts, Hamilton goes straight to Washington and says, now, as the president, you have the executive power to call out the militias and quell this rebellion. And Washington does it. He does it immediately. Hamilton wanted to lead the army. Hamilton wanted to be the one to be out in front to squash this rebellion himself. Washington won't let him. A number of other individuals will take their places in the military and will go and put down the Whiskey Rebellion. It's ended quickly. It is ended quickly. Once troops arrive, the handful of farmers who are evading the tax are no match for them. Crowd politics after this point will no longer work. Crowd politics will no longer work. At this point, we now have a government with limits, but it's a government that still has teeth. If you violate the law, you're in danger of being punished. Now, there is the Whiskey Rebellion and Dr. Evil. All right, conflicts in the north. To the west, we've got problems with the Indians, okay, which we're going to come back to over and over and over again. Across the Atlantic, England and France are at war again, and we have to decide how we're going to handle it. And then we're going to wind up trying to get a treaty with the French called with the British called Jay's Treaty. Okay, and then in the south we have the Haitian Revolution. In the west, 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, we gain all land from England east of the Mississippi River. All land east of the Mississippi River. One problem is the Indians, the Native Americans who already live there. Okay? Most people miss this part. Okay? Two individuals, Arthur St. Clair and Anthony Wayne, they're both generals who fought in the American Revolution. They are the ones who are sent out west to pacify and to take control of these western frontier lands, from this point, all the way through the 1800s, we are going to have conflict with the Native Americans in these regions. As settlers start pushing further west, as we start dictating our manifest destiny, soldiers under the command of these two individuals will be trying to negotiate secession of native lands to these Americans, or if they can't negotiate, then there's going to be conflict. So our actual Indian wars begin almost immediately following the creation of our new Constitution. And as we continue to move west, these conflicts are going to continue to increase. Other conflicts, England and France. 1789, England and France are at war. At first, we're all for it. The French Revolution had happened, and then Louis gets his head chopped off. All of a sudden, we're not so sure we're for it. Initially, when the French Revolution was declared, people like Thomas Jefferson believed, huzzah, what a good influence we've been on the French people to overthrow monarchy and establish a republic. And then, all of a sudden, these guys start chopping people's heads off. And Thomas Jefferson and the other Republicans are like, oh, wait a minute, that's not necessarily what we were talking about. But that's what we're worried about. That's what the Federalists are able at this point to point to these anti-Federalists, who are also known as the Republicans at this point, and say, do you see what excessive democracy can do? Which is why we need to have a stronger central government. Excessive democracy is nothing more than mob rule. Now, when England and this new French government go to war, they approach George Washington and they say, we are calling you to answer the alliance that we made with you back in 1778 when we promised to help you with the British. The French soldiers came and rendered aid, and now that we're fighting the British, we're calling you to honor the alliance and come help us fight the British also. In 1793, when the French make this claim to Washington, Washington issues what's called the Neutrality Proclamation. So the big question is, did Washington violate a treaty that we had with the French? In Washington's mind, no. Because in 1778, Louis was king. Louis XVI. When Louis was king, we had an alliance with France. But Washington says, so where is Louis? Louis is the one we have an alliance with. And the current French government had chopped Louis's head off. So Louis is dead. And so Washington says, oh, well, we don't have an alliance with you. We had an alliance with Louis. And so Washington's able to bow out legitimately, even if possibly trying to rationalize. Washington, however, is a Federalist. Federalists are usually pro-British rather than pro-French. So Washington's Neutrality Proclamation, but Washington issues this proclamation with the caveat that essentially, even though we're not going to politically support you with troops, we will continue to trade with the French in the West Indies and provide you with whatever kind of supplies and materials you need to carry on your conflict in Europe. However, we're not going to become embroiled in the European conflict. Now, as we trade with the French in the West Indies, the British take a look at that and say, your Neutrality Proclamation is bunk. And so what the British are going to do is they're going to start seizing American ships that are found with French cargoes. The sailors who are sailing on these ships will be arrested, and they will be impressed into the British Navy. The ships will become British ships, the sailors will become British sailors, and over 300 ships are going to be seized, and many people in the country believe this is an act of war, and they want Washington to go to war. Well, Washington doesn't want to do that. Washington doesn't want to do that. What Washington says is what we need from the British is a treaty. A treaty that declares our limits. Now, privately, and according to Washington's journals, privately, Washington believes that the only thing he's going to gain in this treaty is official recognition that the British government recognizes us as a legitimate, independent country. For some people, the idea that the ceasefire, the peace treaty that ended the American Revolution, could be construed to say that England is merely no longer fighting and we are officially still part of England. What Washington wants is official recognition with a treaty. If he can get that, then Washington will have accomplished what he desired. Now, we can try to get a whole lot of other things, but Washington held out hope for only one thing, that they would recognize us as independent to the point to where they have to sign a treaty stating the fact that we are an independent country. Okay. So he's going to send John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He will step down, he will come, and he will go to try to get this treaty with the British. Now, John Jay is also a Federalist. The Federalists are very pro-British. They are very pro-central government. They support these kinds of ideas. The Republicans, like Thomas Jefferson and Edmund Randolph, and eventually Madison, are going to be more pro-French. The French were our allies in the war. The French came to our assistance, right? And so between the Federalists and Republicans, they have these two foreign policy differences that are going to be a big deal as we continue to move forward. Now, John Jay is going as an ambassador from the United States to negotiate a treaty. He should have gone to Thomas Jefferson for advice and counsel on what to do in the treaty. But instead, he goes, where's he at? Where'd he go? Instead, he goes to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton's a Federalist. Alexander Hamilton is pro-British. Thomas Jefferson would have wanted him to be more hardline. Even though John Jay was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he's very pro-British. His main concerns are commercial ties with England and compensation for the ships that we've lost. Right? He wants compensation for the ships that we've lost. There are also long-standing problems that the other parts of the country want. For example, all of the slaves that had left the country, they had runaway slaves that had left the country with the British. And so these southern planters want compensation for those slaves. And the British still have a large military contingent across the Mississippi in our western frontiers. And they cross back and forth across the Mississippi into our territory on a regular basis. So we want the military removed. So off John Jay goes to get this treaty. He doesn't visit with Thomas Jefferson to get instructions. What he does is he gets his instructions from Alexander Hamilton. This is going to cause Thomas Jefferson to resign his position as Secretary of State. Jefferson tells Washington, if you wanted Hamilton to be your Secretary of State, you should have appointed him as Secretary of State. And Jefferson will resign, and he'll go to Monticello and wait for the next election, where he'll run for president. So Jay goes to get his treaty. What happens? It's terrible. Nobody's happy. Nobody's happy. Too many concessions to the British, most people think. No provisions for the captured ships. The captured ships were carrying cargoes from France, making them contraband of war. No provision for the lost slaves. The king had issued his proclamation that if these slaves would serve the crown, they would gain their freedom. So therefore, we will make no compensation for the slaves. And they grant more than 18 months for the British to move its military out of our western frontiers, while simultaneously